All right, it's my pleasure to welcome Holly Arrow from the University of Oregon. She'll be our next speaker, talking to us about thinking together socially shared cognition in dyads and groups. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for inviting me. Unlike the abstract, I actually do have a co-author. In fact, that was one of my conditions for doing the paper, is that I had to have a co-author. And it seemed also important, I like it when the structure of the process mirrors the content. So this is a product of socially shared cognition in a new dyad. It's a brand new PhD. I also want to warn you that I'm going to take a somewhat different approach to my talk than is normative. So I'm going to have audience participation, which psychologists do. They like to have people experience the phenomena they're talking about, but also so that the interaction around my talk actually exemplifies more socially shared cognition, which the structure of lecture and then dyadic kind of radio communication does not really exemplify. Okay, first I'm going to give you a little historical recap of the social psychology of the individual in the group. And then I'm going to talk about core configurations, which are characteristic sizes of social units that people assemble in. And then I'm going to hook onto that some studies of socially shared cognition broadly construed relative to dyads, groups, and larger collectives, and then there will be experiential opportunities for socially shared cognition. So psychology has also had its version of the debate about whether it's legitimate to think about groups or study groups as their own entities. And Floyd Allport was very influential in this. He was a psychologist who published two pamphlets. One of them was The Group Fallacy in the Social Sciences, and then there was another one, The Group Fallacy, I can't remember what the other one is. But he was exhorting psychologists to steer clear of this dangerous group fallacy, which he defined as the error of substituting the group as a whole as a principle of explanation in place of the individuals in the group. And then he gave various justifications against this danger. And one of them was a philosophy of science argument that in the hierarchy of sciences, the field of description of one science becomes the field of explanation for the science immediately above it. And then he explained what that meant. The psychologist describes behavior and explains it in terms of reflex mechanisms, which was an old way of saying that neurology should be the basis of psychological explanation. And we do have a field of neuroscience now, which he would approve of, but then it was just reflexes. Those were how you explain behavior. Then he makes further argument the work of sociology would be to describe social aggregates and sort of change in terms of the group, but to explain these phenomena in terms of the social psychology of the individual. So there's another embedded argument about the proper role of psychology versus sociology, and we should respect the disciplinary boundaries. I also added this quote from Karl Popper: from the standpoint of history, although not of logic, methodologies are usually byproducts of philosophical views. Because in psychology, methodology is very important in making choices about what to study. So, the social psychology of the individual is most social psychology in the field of psychology done by psychologists. And I say that carefully because there are actually two social psychologies. One of them in the discipline of psychology and one of them in the discipline of sociology. And I was actually in my 3rd year of graduate school before I discovered this whole other group of people calling themselves social psychologists, who are basically micro-sociologists. And they use a lot of social network theory and methodology. So there are many social psychologists who are psychologists who don't even know these other people exist. The first flowering of the social psychology of the individual was the psychology of social attitudes and how people behave in social settings. And this flourished in part in response to Floyd Alpert's definition of what social psychology should be. So they studied how people behaved individually when they were in a social setting, and they also studied social attitudes, so attitudes towards other people. But this prevented them from worrying about the group fallacy. Social settings, however, was treated as relatively generic, so there wasn't really a theory of social settings. It was just sort of a general surround. So this was a rather unsophisticated characteristic. So an example of behavior in social settings, social facilitation is the tendency to work harder in the presence of others. And that was an early sort of social psychology finding. It applied to people, it also applied to cockroaches. Cockroaches exert more effort in solving mazes in the presence of other cockroaches. There was a second wave of social psychology of the individual that happened later in the 1970s and 1980s. Social psychologists mostly abandoned social settings and actually stopped studying social behavior. Instead, they adopted the methods of cognitive psychology, which is, at that time, was you measure reaction times when pushing buttons. So the behavior was really pushing buttons. And then you look at how fast people push buttons, and you make inferences about what's going on inside their heads. And they still do this. And so what they did was they studied how people respond to social stimuli, such as pictures of people or lists of traits. So the field of person perception, stereotypes. So really, what they were doing was cognitive psychology, and there was sort of this envy of cognitive psychology and its success, but they just used social objects as stimuli. So whereas cognitive psychologists might show people colored squares, different numbers of colored squares, and then you respond and so on, and then you study shape perception or memory or whatever. Social psychologists could be real scientists like cognitive scientists, and they could study people pushing buttons. They would just show the pictures of people instead. But originally, what this is called social cognition, they didn't have any theory that the processing of social objects was different in any way from the processing of other objects. It was just a way for social psychologists to jump on and do cognitive science as well. Now, cognitive scientists stumbled over one of the important differences when people are processing social objects as compared to other kinds of objects. And this was in the discovery that the processing of faces as objects is profoundly different. And actually, if you used faces as stimuli, you can mess up your results. Sort of like in the comparative psychology days, if you wanted to study animals and infer how people, or actually all animals behave, you don't use cats. Okay, the behavior is just, so don't use faces because faces are somehow special. And they're special because they're social. So I wanted to point out that I see the term social cognition used a lot in the field and outside the field, and people obviously intend to mean something much broader than what it is inside the specialty of social psychology. And so I use socially shared cognition to sort of signal that I have a broader view, a view more congruent with what most people think it ought to mean. There was also the social psychology of the group, which continued despite Alport's exhortations. First as just a kind of a sub-area, then it blossomed, and then it went back to a sub-area. So around the 1930s, it emerged with studies of such topics as leadership and group climate. Group climate is a group-level entity, and the emergence of norms. So early on, there was already this interest in the emergence of things at the group level from the individual level. Group dynamics then flourished in the 1950s and 60s with a focus on topics such as intergroup conflict and cooperation. Very famous study in 1961, the Robbers Cave study. And it flourished in part because they developed new methods of studying the group. In the Robbers Cave study, they organized to have two groups of 11-year-old boys go to camp at the Robbers Cave Park in Oklahoma, and then the camp counselors were all also trained as research assistants, and they mapped the social network of the boys, they looked at the friendship patterns, they looked how they behaved, who they talked to, and then they promoted intergroup conflict between the two groups of boys, which turned out was very easy. It sort of happened naturally. And then they tried to damp down that conflict and promote intergroup cooperation. Very famous study, very influential, but it was illustrating there's ways to study groups. You can look at the social networks, you can look at how those change, you can look at the children's behavior, you can ask them questions, and this methodological advances made it legitimate. So in sort of the opposite of Popper's insight holds with psychology, because psychologists love empirical questions and they love data. So if they take a stance, well, you can't study X, that's illegitimate, okay? Often what they mean is, you don't have good methods. You haven't figured out how to study X in a way that generates data that's going to be interesting to us. If you can find a methodology, then it's like, oh, well, that's okay, just go to your lab, well, let us know what you find. So those philosophical debates tend to evaporate in the face of new shiny techniques that we can use. And so that happened for a while. Group decision-making was also a focus, and group development. Group development is basically how groups systematically change over time. So if you've heard about forming, storming, norming, that goes back to Tubman. It went into decline with psychology with the rise of social cognition, these shiny new methods. It is alive and well as an interdisciplinary field now, so many people who trained in group psychology went into sociology, organizational behavior, political science, communications. So the people who trained in my lab are spread across the disciplines. One of the reasons it went into decline was not for philosophical reasons. There was no worry about the legitimacy of the group, but because using social cognitive methods, you can generate a lot of data quickly. It's fast and easy to do studies. This is very attractive to people building careers. Studying groups takes a long time, it takes more subjects, the methods are more difficult, it's more challenging in a lot of ways, and so it's not really a good path to build a career. Those things matter too. Two perspectives came in around the 90s, became important in terms of new ways of thinking about social behavior in psychology. One of them was the evolutionary perspective, the other was complexity theory and dynamic systems theory, which was introduced in detail yesterday. In the early days of group dynamics, there was an argument that groups of a certain size should have characteristic behaviors that could be investigated systematically. But what constituted the impact of group size and whether there was, what sizes you should study was kind of left unexplored. And in practice, what most group dynamics experiments studied were very small groups of 3 to 4. Why? Because subjects are expensive. So you wanted to study the smallest units possible. So there wasn't a lot of theorizing about group size. Linda Caporio and her colleague Barron, however, taking an evolutionary perspective, asked, are there actually characteristic group sizes? And the answer is yes. There are characteristic units in which people repeatedly assemble. That is still true, and there's empirical evidence to support this. And they also looked a lot about anthropological data on hunter-gatherers, which are thought to represent most closely what has been social organization for a long period of our history as a species. One of the units that's characteristic is the dyad. It is the first unit of social interaction for the infant. It's very important, and Caporio identified characteristics of these units, including sort of social cognitive characteristics. One of the things that is learned and developed in the dyad is micro-coordination. In the teen, which is sort of 3 to 6, and there's social psychological support for there being sort of a sweet spot in group size, 4 to 5 is an excellent size. It's small enough that everybody gets a chance to talk, enough people there for there to be some diversity of perspectives and skills. When you get into groups of size 8 or 9, it becomes unwieldy. There's going to be people who hardly speak, and that unevenness of participation gets worse and worse the larger the group is, and it's extremely reliant finally. And observations of naturally occurring groups finds that sort of 3 to 6 are a good size. If you work in a restaurant as a server, you don't get a lot of groups over that size. Most tables are set up for maximum 6. We were more than that last night, but the conversational groupings at dinner last night were not 14. They fell into dyads, some triads or quartets. So there's also a constraint in terms of just hearing people talk that limits group size. The T is the prototypical unit for collective action and what she calls distributed cognition. And I'll come back to that some more. The band, which is 20 to 30, is the extended family, in a sense, and in the hunter-gatherer band, it's the unit that overnights together, okay? It's the unit that stays together, is about that size, the traveling band. And then the macro band is a seasonal gathering of bands who come together who consider themselves to be the same peoples. And that, in the hunter-gatherer world and from early times, was seen to be the unit for the standardization of language. And if you go into parts of Europe that have very stable population, you will get recognizable dialogues, for example, on either side of the river in a village. So the macro band is kind of the unit for people who not only speak the same language but the same dialect. And then the band is the unit for the shared construction of reality, which we heard about earlier, and also social identity. Who are we? And actually, both macro band and band can be the focus of attachment for who are we? What groups do I belong to? In the modern world, of course, we have much bigger groups. So this gets extended out to nations, to ethnic groups, to everybody who speaks my language, which now is vast numbers of people. But the psychology is similar. Those are my are the site for joint attention, dynamic coupling, and collaborative learning. So I want you to pair up with a neighbor. So everybody's got to pair up. And tell them something surprising or maybe unusual about yourself. For example, my unusual thing is I live in a geodesic dome in Oregon, in the forest. But dyadic conversation serves that. What you were just doing is you were enacting joint attention. And joint attention is something that is learned in dyads and develops in infants. There's two forms of joint attention that have been distinguished by developmental psychologists. They're RJA and IJA. So responding to joint attention, the first one is if somebody else is looking and pointing that you follow to see what they're attending to. Young chimpanzees do this. Infants start doing it by 6 months, they do it. Initiating joint attention is using eye gaze and gesture to direct the attention of others to what you are attending to. Infants do that by a year. Chimpanzees never do it. So, in a sense, if we think of social cognition in the narrow sense of attending to social objects, chimpanzees do that. In fact, other animals do that too. They understand eyes. If they see a conspecific gazing at stuff, they'll look to see what they're looking, sort of what they're looking at. Is there food there? Is there something interesting? They're using the social object as a source of information. But chimpanzees don't really respond to pointing. Pointing is an active attempt to direct the attention of others. So that's more of a social act. Children understand it really early and start doing it themselves. They start trying to direct the attention of others to whatever they're attending to. This is important. And that joint attention is not just the fact of sharing attention. It's not attention in common only. but it's also that both of the parties know that they have it in common. They're occupying a shared psychological space of attention to the same thing. Dyadic coupling is another thing that develops in the mothers and infants, and not just mothers, but again, that's usually the first. And an example that's studied is coactive laughter. So there was a study where they measured laughter between mothers and their children. This is a pre-verbal time, so the child's not speaking yet, but they're generating sound, babbling. And they studied it in a longitudinal study, so I think it started at first year and through the second year. And what they found, that the coordination of laughter between mother and children became increasingly tight over time. In other words, they're learning to couple their behavior closely. And laughter is an expressive act. And that coordination is another kind of scaffold, maybe using that in a little bit different way than you were using it. But the capacity for joint attention and dynamic coupling is a scaffolding for learning language. Very important. If you think of conversation, I just had you do a conversation. It relies on joint attention, but now you can't point with your finger to an object, but you use language to coordinate so that you know you're talking about the same subject. And it's also true, although you're not necessarily aware of it or consciously controlling it, that people in conversation together start coordinating their gestures and their bodily postures, facial expressions, and that dynamic coupling supports the communication. How do we know that? In part because what happens when it's absent. So, autistic children often have language delays. Is this a problem with their language centers? Not necessarily. They do not do some of the things that create the scaffold for language. They're less likely to do the dynamic coupling, and they don't often develop, certainly as early, and sometimes not evident, that initiating of joint attention. Another, even more basic difference in people on the spectrum is their difference in how they respond to faces. They respond to faces more like those early social cognitive researchers thought. They're just another object. If you have a painting and there's people in it, and you do eye tracking experiments, normally developing children, and most of us, we'll spend a lot more time looking at the faces. Faces are inherently attractive objects. If you look at the eye gaze of children on the spectrum, they lack the bias. They may look at a machine or some books. Faces aren't inherently interesting. And lacking the bias that pulls the attention to the face, they don't get the information in the same way, and they also aren't following gaze in the same way. So people are not profoundly and absorbingly interesting to autistic children in the same way they are to normal children. And without that scaffold, they don't get some of the other stuff that normally developing children get. So in conversation, you have the dynamic coupling, you have the shared joint attention where you're talking about the same subject and you know you are talking about it. And we can continue that at all kinds of levels of abstraction. It's very powerful. Another difference with humans as compared to chimps, and this is Peng troglodyte, common chimps that we know the most about, is the difference between social learning versus destructive learning. Chimpanzees are perfectly capable of social learning, which is you watch how others behave and you learn things. And you think, well, maybe I'll try that too. Instructive learning is when people do something for the sake of demonstrating to the learner, and they're checking, and the learner knows that you're doing it as a demonstration. That's very different. And it's, again, scaffolded with joint attention. An example of that is that, so adult chimpanzees don't actively demonstrate skills, although there's some debate about whether that actually is true. It is true that infants and juveniles can learn from watching adults. But in experiments with 12 to 14-month-old children, when adults cue that they're actively demonstrating something, as opposed to just doing it, they look a lot more attentively. They know, they understand that this is for their purpose, pay attention. So these are some of the early social cognitive capacities that develop in the dyad in childhood. Small work groups. So this is the 3 to 6 prototype, or small family groups. If you go far enough back in time, that's the first unit. You're working with your siblings. The men in the tribe are working together on their tasks. The women in the tribe are working together on their tasks. And so I want you to divide into groups of 3. And I use my phone. I guess I can use time not in my phone to time you. Divide into groups of 3. And they don't have to
What do you have? There's one person.
Is everybody in a group of 3? You might need to be in a group of 4. But I want everyone, everyone has to be in a group. Okay, we're going to start. You're going to pay attention. Oh, good, there's people now. You're going to pay attention to everyone walking past for a minute. Go. I'm looking at the phones. Okay, stop. Yeah, that was a lot of input. But we're doing a collaborative recall experiment. Now you would try and write down everything that you remember. So there's a lot of people, and actually that was long. You try and write down everything that you remember. Not that you remember, but you
Can we talk about it?
So why don't we'll just do it briefly. say you're all three-person, and how many people you were able to recall. And I compared it to the output of 3 separate individuals, groups wouldn't have as much. Okay, this is called collaborative inhibition. So you wouldn't remember as much. Okay, so it looks like groups aren't as good at this task. You should just leave it to individuals.
Sorry, but you use only 1 minute. So there is that much that you can see in 1 minute.
Right. So if we were, I'm not running this, I'm not collecting actual data. in a controlled experiment, I would give you a word list. Okay, because like, I don't know, I didn't videotape it. I don't have a standard for accuracy. I give you a word list, you try and memorize all the words or something like that. Then I take them away from you, you try to recall them and so on. Everything would be very controlled. And you give them enough time where they kind of run to ground, okay? So it looks like groups aren't as good as individuals. However, there's also a follow-up finding, because a lot of these studies would then, afterwards, individually, now you try and recall, okay, each individual, to see if, to test one of the theories, which is that people could have remembered more, but because they were talking, okay, you have to put stuff aside, you can get back to it, it's still there. What they found is individuals who've been in the group recall condition, when you test them the second time individually, now they outperform people who were always individuals. So it looks like there is a stimulus to memory at least one of the phases, and it may be well at the encoding phase. So there's also the group attention effect. And the group attention effect is that when you know that others are paying attention to the same thing, you devote more cognitive resources to encoding. You process, there's more elaborative processing, you remember more, you know more details, you have more emotional attachment. So when others are attending to the same thing we're attending to and we know it, it makes what is attended to seem more important and meaningful. With one restriction. They have to be members of your in-group, or at least people who are friendly that you like, that you might want to be members of your in-group. If it's people who you do not consider your in-group, the effect disappears. And this has been demonstrated in experiments where they cross those two conditions. You're either attending at the same time to the same thing, and you know it, and it's an in-group member, or it's an out-group member, that's one. Or the other condition is you're attending to something, and you know that others are attending, but you're told they're paying attention to something else. They have something else to study. Now what you're looking at doesn't benefit from that. So if you think of the joint attention, our ability to organize our attention so we're attending together, that generalizes to the group level, and automatically makes those things more important and meaningful. Why would that be? What function would that serve? It means that in groups of people, in work groups, when there's something that you're supposed to be paying attention to, if you're in your in-group, you automatically devote more cognitive resources to this. It's not intentional, it's automatic. This obviously would help the group do its task well, and the additional meaningfulness and so on helps promote group cohesion. So it helps the small group function. Another topic that has been investigated is collective perception, and that comes out of this early work of the emergence and perception of perceptual norms. And it has epistemic implications because you get this effect, particularly when there's ambiguity. So people are motivated to resolve ambiguous information. If others are present, you will use them to to help you resolve ambiguous information. The original studies by Garinther Sharif, who also did the Robbers Cave study, who was very influential in inventing lots of methodologies, he used something called the autokinetic effect. In a completely darkened room, if there is a point of light, it will appear that it moves. It doesn't, but partly this is because of the saccades that we have in our eyes naturally. The light will appear to move. And so they use this effect. They would put people in a darkened room and they'd ask them how far did the light move. And then they would give an estimate of how far it moved. Now, if people are together with others in a room and are calling out their estimates, they quickly converge onto a norm of how far it moves. Are they just conforming? No, because if they're then tasted later individually, that norm persists. That's now how far they see it move. They've resolved the ambiguity. This is the reality, or the best they can get. Whereas, I'll stop there with that. There's a follow-up experiment done by Jacobs and Campbell many years later, but using the same paradigm. And they were interested in the persistence of norms, not just if it starts in a group and goes to an individual, but could they get people to violate their own perceptions? And some of you may know of the Ash studies where they show people lines that are long and short, and Confederates say, oh, it's short, when, you know, which one's shorter, that one. And you can see with your eyes it's that wrong. It's wrong, but many people will go along with it, or at least go along with it sometimes. So they either seeded the group with people who would give implausibly long distances that were sort of outside what individuals normally perceive, or within that kind of range of acceptance that is typical. And then they would take people out of the group and put new people in. They do the task again, so they kept rotating people in and out, so they would have several generations. And the norms persisted. So new people coming into the group would conform to the norm. And this is a way to kind of model the transmission of culture, that norms persist across generations. Now, what if the norm was unreasonably large? What would happen is they would converge on it, but over generations, it would decay toward a range that was in that realm of acceptance, which shows that both the influence of the others on perceptions, but when it kind of violates what we would naturally perceive, the norm drifts. It creates a bias back to it. A later body of work on collective perception looked at eye tracking movements, and this is a little bit like the group attention studies. In the design, people would look at, they'd have a selection of pictures they could look at, and they either believed that they were looking at the pictures alone, or that others were seeing the same pictures. And the outcome of this is that it shifts people's attention so that if they were looking at the pictures alone, they spent more time looking at the negative pictures. So they had pictures with negative valence images and positive valence. If they thought they were looking at it at the same time others were, they went for the positive pictures. So thinking that others are attending to the same objects also shifts our attention from more negative valence things to more positive valence things. Explanation for this is, again, we still have the brains that were designed for us through natural selection. If you are alone, if you think you are alone, then you better pay attention to negative things. Could be danger. But if there's a whole group watching out for things, then if something that's negative, somebody's liable to notice. You can relax more and you can focus on positive things. Now, this tendency to focus on positive things when you are enjoying attention with other groups, again, could support some cohesion and positive feelings inside the group. Okay, I'm doing time. I've got
Maybe 10 more minutes.
okay. Transactive memory systems are another big area of distributed cognition. And distributed cognition is the ability of groups to organize their resources collaboratively in pursuit of goal. So in this case, it's organizing information. A transactive memory system is the collaborative encoding, storage, and retrieval of information through the cognitive division of labor in dyads and groups. So knowledge is divided and distributed through the group based on expertise, and this eases the cognitive workload on members. So this way, a group, connected to the group knowledge question, a group can know more than any individual in the group, and the transactive memory is both the distribution of the knowledge and an indexing system that members learn so they know who knows what. So I know everybody here has different bodies of knowledge. That's less useful to me if I don't know what they are. But in a group that has a transactive memory system, I not only know that information is distributed, but I know who knows what. So that I can use you as an external storage system, and if somebody asks me a question, like, well, I don't know that, but I know who does. So this also can generalize to organizations, and you probably all know who the person is, often a staff person. If you need something done, you go to the person who's tied into the most expansive transactive memory system. They may not know it, but they know how to find out, because they know who knows what. That's a transactive memory system. Now, the collaborative recall generally just use lists of things that everybody gets the same information. There's another body of studies called the hidden profile studies, where they give people different sets of information and they need to put it all together to solve a group task. One of the findings with that is that groups don't do a great job because they favor the information they have in common compared to the information that people have uniquely. Very reliable effect. Also misleading. Misleading because these are experiments usually with people who've never interacted together. So yes, this might be true of brand new formed groups, but most groups who are interested in the world have been operating together for a while. And they have transactive memory systems. So if you change the characteristics of the study to mimic that, the effect can be diminished or removed. For example, by telling people about expert roles, and that you actually have more information about suspect A, and you have more information about suspect B, and this person has more information about means and motive. If you know your expertise in the others, then that goes away because you're now experts and you're sharing the information. Okay. I'm going to skip through and end with a real-life phenomenon which has been both a topic of interest to me because I study psychology of war, but also because I'm very interested in this collective memory thing. So I'm going to read to you information from a journalist who interviewed people after the Rwandan genocide. Interviewed both survivors and killers. And this really ties in very nicely to this kind of motivated forgetting issue. And I didn't have to cover that because it was already covered, including the socially shared approval-induced forgetting. So I'm just going to read to you some information it says, trying to get people to retrieve their memories. So this is sort of an overview. The silence on the Rwandan hills is indescribable. Tutsi survivors managed to surmount the silence only amongst themselves. But within the community of killers, innocent or guilty, so this is basically all Hutus, whether or not they were blameless in the genocide, each person plays the role of either a mute or an amnesiac. So after he does a book interviewing with the survivors, he decides he wants to interview some killers and see what their memories are. He has a hard time doing this, but finally he hooks up with somebody connects him to a group of prisoners who are in prison awaiting trial, who were all members of the same gang. And they talk amongst themselves, and they agree. They will talk to him, they will talk to him openly, they will share what happened, what they did. Curiously, however, during his first meetings with the men, they mostly act like the amnesiacs and mutes outside the prison. They have personally done or seen nothing. They have nothing to share. And he's confused because they all agree, they talked about it, they agreed about this. He's interviewing them one by one. No, nothing happened, I have nothing to recall. But every now and then, the subject becomes cooperative and talks freely about what happened. He's interviewing them in French. And he says, he's mystified until he realizes the key is whether he asks questions using the singular informal tu or the plural you, vous. For example, to the question, can you two describe how you two would begin your mornings, they would say, I would get up, I would go to the field to cut the sorghum and count the goats. But to the very same question, but phrase, can you two describe how you, vous, plural, would begin your mornings, they would answer, we would get up at dawn, we would gather on the soccer field, then we would go down to the marshes and search the papyrus using the machetes. Now, Hatzfield interprets this as the killers are trying to hide behind the reed. But I think a different explanation is possible, because another area of my research, psychology of war, I'm very interested on the impact of war on soldiers and the psychological difficulties many soldiers have, including grappling with things they've done, like killing people. Even if it was legitimate, even if it was in their role, most people are raised to think killing is bad. This is called moral injury. One of the protective factors against moral injury is being in a very cohesive group, band of brothers that's tightly bonded. I began to wonder, I don't know quite how to investigate it, but are these memories not stored, attached to the individual self, but stored, attached to the collective self? And so, in the sense of group action, they didn't do it. They, as a group, the agent, a coordinated team, would go out together with their machetes and murder their neighbors. But maybe the memories are attached to the group so that they can be retrieved without a great deal of personal remorse. And this is something else that disturbs Hatfield a great deal, is that they most of them show almost no remorse. When he talks, he asks them sort of leading questions like, it must have been difficult, it must have been hard to do this. And they'd say things like, yeah, there were long days and it was really hot, and sometimes we got in lunch breaks. I mean, really weird. But if the memories are attached to the group as the agent, it may buffer or protect the individual so that the individual doesn't feel guilt and doesn't have to struggle with the psychological implications. I don't know yet how to study this, but that's sort of how I'm thinking, how to connect these things. I'll end there.